My name is David Franz. I'm the curator at One National Gay and Lesbian Archives in Los Angeles. One is the largest LGBTQ archive in the world and the oldest active queer organization in the United States. So we're here today because the Nottingham Contemporary has invited One to exhibit materials from the archive in their small collections room exhibitions. And we've organized a show called Trade Secrets. From the beginning was collecting material and was interested, maybe not as the priority of the organization, but producing some kind of archive. And then concurrently with this, we also have a man named Jim Kepner, who was very involved with One, as well as numerous gay organizations in Los Angeles. And he was producing his own LGBTQ archive out of his apartment in Los Angeles. And he started collecting beginning in the 1940s. And then later down the line in the 1990s, his archive and the organization that was One, they merged together and they formed the collection that is today One National Gay and Lesbian Archive. So One Archive is the largest archive of its type in the world, but many people still within the United States and especially internationally aren't aware of this incredible resource that exists in Los Angeles. Projects like this, as well as exhibitions that I'm working on at the archive in Los Angeles, are meant to draw greater public awareness to this collection. This collection is publicly accessible for anyone, regardless of their being a scholar. It's a community resource, so people need to come down to this archive and start exploring because you have no idea what you're going to find. So I think this display is very eclectic in that it spans almost a century of queer content from the archive. So spotlighting these small moments and mixing them all up is really a very appropriate way to engage with this material. LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer questioning. And this is an acronym that has been adopted by the queer community for a while now. But if you look back, so during the 1950s, LGBTQ was not used. They were using homosexual, or they were also using a term called homophile, which was a made-up kind of term that distanced themselves from homosexual that had connotations of criminality and perversion. So I think maybe some of the materials here display kind of a changing evolution of how the community has talked about themselves and conceived of defining themselves. The title of this exhibition was found in the Queen's Vernacular, which is a gay lexicon assembled by Bruce Rogers. This book is incredibly detailed and has a slew of terms that I have never heard of, dating back throughout the 20th century, used by gay queer people. So Trade Secrets in the Queen's Vernacular is defined as homosexual information not freely given to those not friends. Or is really interesting when applied to the cabinet display here, which obviously involves some sense of discovery and looking through and kind of peeking into some illicit maybe materials. So we've curated materials for the 4 cabinets in this room. The first cabinet is a selection of materials on artist Sidney Bronstein that One has a collection about. Sidney was an amateur painter in Los Angeles during the 1950s. And his story is very interesting because he was very obsessed with servicemen from the US military during the period in Los Angeles. And he was not only painting portraits of men that he would meet while cruising in downtown Los Angeles, specifically in Pershing Square, which is the central kind of park in the downtown area. But he was also recording a log of his sexual encounters with these men that was incredibly detailed in all the amounts, going from things like the service they were in to their ethnicity, how they engaged in sexual activity, where they went for such activity. So he obviously had a very deep passion for archiving his own sexual history. And not only was he doing this for his own enjoyment, but he was also sending copies of this log off to Alfred Kinsey, who was well known in the period in America for the controversial Kinsey reports on human sexuality. So in the second cabinet, we have a selection of queer publications and zines from the 1950s through to the 1990s. So it's a really eclectic display of early queer publications like The Ladder, which was a homophile lesbian publication published out of San Francisco, and then other zines later from the 1980s like JD's, which was a very famous zine published out of Toronto by Bruce LaBruce and G.B. Jones. And then in the third cabinet, we have a selection of materials related to One magazine, which is the namesake of One Archives. One was founded in 1952 with the purpose to publish a magazine that was first conceived and published in January 1953. And this was the first magazine that was widely distributed in the US for homosexuals. So it was really groundbreaking at the time. Just having a magazine that actually said homosexual on the cover was unheard of during the 1950s. Homosexuality was one of the things that if you were discovered to be a homosexual, it could destroy your career. You were essentially blacklisted. If you were discovered to be engaging in like lewd conduct, which is homosexual acts of any kind, you could be sent away to prison. The founders of this magazine were putting themselves out there, and being involved with this was incredibly courageous and risky for their reputations at the time. One of the most famous issues of One was an early issue from 1953 that has across the cover homosexual marriage with a question mark. So this really demonstrates that, I think, and it's very surprising for contemporary viewers, that this magazine was really engaging with a lot of politics that we think of were not part of queer discourse in the 1950s, both in the United States and also internationally. One was really setting a standard for progressive politics in the homosexual community at the time. For One magazine, we also have a selection of drawings, two original drawings by one of the founders, Tony Reyes, who was one of the original founders of One and was an amateur artist in his own right and also a flamingo dancer, which is very interesting. One original drawing that was used for a cover, so the drawing is displayed alongside the cover. And then there's another drawing that was never published in the magazine, but was submitted. And then additionally, we also have a selection of printing blocks, many that are by a woman named Joan Corbin, who used the pseudonym Eve Ellery in the magazine. And she was the art director for One from the beginning. And some of the really amazing woodblock prints that are just really beautiful are by Joan Corbin, Eve Ellery. So she's one figure who hasn't really gotten a lot of historical recognition. The fourth cabinet is a very eclectic display. We have a selection of material from the Ralph W. Judd collection on cross-dressing in the performing arts. The collection spans materials from the entirety of the 20th century, and Judd was really obsessed with collecting materials that were related to cross-dressing in any form. So one of the most interesting parts of the collection is a selection of sheet music from the 1920s and 30s primarily that is really interesting for contemporary viewers because most people don't realize that cross-dressing in the early part of the 20th century was considered kind of family entertainment, was not illegal, that it was very public and was something that was widely accepted, and that you later then have changes throughout the mid part of the 20th century in the United States that really changes the country's understanding of cross-dressing. In the United States, by the 1950s, during the McCarthy era, cross-dressing laws are more strictly enforced. So people that are caught wearing opposite gender clothing are arrested and thrown in jail. And there are lots of terrifying stories for the period of that. The cabinet has a selection of materials related to Julian Eltage, who is a very famous vaudeville performer in drag to 1910s and 20s. In 1930s, Julian Eltage was so famous that he had his own magazine for a period that specifically was targeted towards women in selling beauty products. So we have a copy of the magazine on display, as well as small postcards that were used to market products, as well as one of his most famous performances. And then additionally in this cabinet, we also have a selection of buttons and other ephemera from the collections at One, primarily from the 1970s and 80s. So a lot of really great, radical, very public statements on buttons, which people would wear to rallies and protests and events, and really putting your sexuality out there in public.